So let's, I guess, start with a very broad question. Um, we use the word unprecedented, unfortunately, a lot, it seems like, in modern times. Is this an unprecedented time when it comes to talk about a president dropping out of a run for re-election at this stage in the game?
It really is, and particularly given that the talk centers around his incapacity, not policy disagreements with the president, with his own party, not a revolt of the voters or some ideological faction, but really just a question of whether the president has the capability to continue forward as a candidate and to continue forward in the office. We really do not have any parallel to that situation in modern times.
How would it potentially work? I mean, we are what, 6 weeks away from a convention, if that. And so, how would this potentially work if Joe Biden made the decision, which I know is certainly not a done deal, but if he made the decision to step away, how would it work?
Well, that would be the easiest way for this to work, is if he voluntarily steps aside. By far, that's the easiest path, because there are enough pledged delegates for Joe Biden to get the nomination for him. And then wriggling out of those pledges is not 100% impossible, but it's very difficult. So the path forward really involves Joe Biden voluntarily stepping aside. If he does, he could release his delegates. Now, he could either endorse someone else and ask them to support that person that he has endorsed, or he could say, I leave it to your judgment and your determination who the best nominee for the Democratic Party would be. Even if Biden does endorse someone, he cannot bind his delegates to that other person. If he releases his delegates, he can ask them to support a given individual, but at that point, it's entirely up to them which way they go on the convention floor.
So the convention, is that what we would call a brokered convention?
It would be if you go into the convention with no nominee. Well, we would call it an open convention. It only becomes brokered if there are, in fact, brokers. If somebody steps forward to actually orchestrate things and arrange a particular outcome. So maybe elites would step forward, people like perhaps Barack Obama, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries. They could be the brokers who would try to arrange a particular scenario, or it could just be truly open if Biden steps aside and just leaves it to the delegates to hash things out and figure out who the replacement would be.
That sounds chaotic.
It would be chaotic, inevitably so. But what the Democrats are weighing right now is whether some measure of chaos is preferable to moving forward with a candidate who has clearly been damaged in the eyes of the electorate. And that's what all of the party bigwigs and all the rank and file delegates are trying to assess right now.
Take me back to 1968, because I know that was a different situation, but we did have a president who was in office, LBJ, who decided, you know what, I'm not going to run for re-election. And that came at a different time because it was March. It was much earlier in the process. But is that any sort of comparison to where we are right now?
I think it's strained for a couple of reasons. First of all, because LBJ stepped aside not for reasons of incapacity, but because of widespread objections to the Vietnam War and a kind of revolt by some constituencies in the Democratic Party against his Vietnam policy. The other reason it's different is that did happen earlier. It happened in March, so the party had months to figure out what it was going to do going forward. But here's the most important difference. That happened before the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the early 1970s that changed the nomination rules. Back in 1968, the party bosses still had a lot more power to orchestrate an outcome. Since the early 70s, the primaries have been given a lot more binding weight, and that makes a last-minute substitution a lot trickier than it would have been in 1968.
So that brings me back. You mentioned this off the top, but explain for people who maybe don't understand what a delegate actually is. Who are these delegates who will be at the Democratic convention next month, whose job it feels like has somewhat gotten more important over the course of the last week or so?
Well, the delegates are people who are chosen in the primaries and caucuses that happen in every state and jurisdiction, including Puerto Rico and American Samoa and the U.S. territories, District of Columbia, during the course of the nominating season that begins in early February and runs through June. That is all finished. All the primaries and caucuses are done. And each state has selected delegates that are pledged to a particular candidate. The overwhelming majority of them on the Democratic side are pledged to Joe Biden. Um, Now, those people are supposed to vote for the person to whom they are pledged on at least the first ballot, unless he or she withdraws and releases them. So these people are pledged to vote for Joe Biden unless he withdraws or releases them. So that's what, of course, everybody's waiting to see, is whether he, in fact, pushes ahead and rallies the troops and rights the ship, or whether, in fact, some pressure is brought to bear on him to get him to step aside and release these delegates to support whoever they may choose.
Just a few more questions for you. What does this mean for the vice presidency? Does it automatically, I mean, clearly if the president dies in office, we know what happens. But what about for a nominee? Does it automatically go to Kamala Harris, or is it not necessarily going to be her?
It does not automatically go to her. If Biden were tomorrow to step aside and say, I no longer want the Democratic nomination for president, that does not mean that his delegates then become obligated to vote for Kamala Harris. It does not mean that the convention is obligated to nominate Kamala Harris for the presidency. They might choose to do so, but if Biden releases his delegates, they're released to support anyone. And a bunch of names have been put forward of possibilities, ranging from Gavin Newsom to Gretchen Whitmer to Michelle Obama to what have you. So Kamala Harris certainly is in the mix, but no decision that Biden can make binds the Democratic Party to choose her as their nominee.
Let's talk money, because that's really at the heart of everything. Clearly, the people who have donated to Biden's reelection campaign have donated to him. What happens with that money? Should he choose to step away? Could that money go to someone else, or what happens?
So this really depends on whether Kamala Harris remains on the ticket in some capacity. Money that has been contributed thus far has technically been contributed to the Biden-Harris reelection campaign. If Kamala Harris remains on the ticket as either the presidential or the vice presidential nominee, the ticket can continue to spend the money basically seamlessly. If Kamala Harris is not on the ticket in either spot, then they've got a mess, because then the new ticket would have to raise money from scratch. Now, they could do that. The Democratic Party has lots and lots of well-heeled donors, but it certainly creates a hassle and some fundraising challenges, at least in the short term, if Kamala Harris is entirely booted from the ticket.
Could the money go to a PAC? Could the Biden-Harris, if they chose to do this, could the Biden-Harris campaign said, you know what, we're going to send it to a PAC, and then the PAC decides what to do with it?
Yeah, there's a lot of murkiness of campaign finance law, because we are in this unprecedented situation, and they could return money to the donors. Donors could specify that they want their funds to go somewhere else, perhaps to the new ticket. There could be some sort of PAC established, but a PAC specifically to do what? That would be up in the air. Support Democrats generally, support the new ticket. I mean, there are just a lot of different permutations that could play out if we get to that unprecedented scenario.
Okay, I guess to wrap up, it's feasible, it's unprecedented, it's difficult. Is that the way to describe sort of what could potentially happen?
Yes. And I think it's still important to remember, it is more likely than not that Joe Biden will continue as the nominee of the Democratic Party. That's the most likely scenario at this point, but it's less likely than it was a week ago. And certainly discussions of him stepping aside are much more realistic now than they were before the debate. So we'll see how it plays out. It really is extremely difficult to boot him from the ticket without his consent. If, however, he can be persuaded to step aside, it is difficult and complicated, but certainly possible to replace him and move forward with another nominee.
And this one would be my final question. It requires a bit of opinion on your part, but would it be would a candidate who would emerge, should Joe Biden step away, either voluntarily or non-voluntarily, have any chance? Because it seems like it's just not possible given the length of the campaign and how close we are to election day.
Yeah, I do think another nominee would have a chance, just like I think Joe Biden has a chance. And that's because Donald Trump is such a polarizing figure. We know that there's a substantial portion of the American electorate that would vote for a ham sandwich over Donald Trump. I mean, they would vote for any alternative on the ballot to Donald Trump. That gives whoever the Democratic nominee is a fighting chance. Now, this is not the position the Democratic Party wanted to be in. It's difficult and fraught for a whole host of reasons. Trump is leading in the polls right now against every Democratic alternative that is mentioned. So it's a bad situation for the Democratic Party to be in. But, let's remember that from a strictly political standpoint, whatever people may think in their own opinions, Donald Trump's got political baggage. He's got some difficulties himself that he brings into the election campaign. So I think it's pretty clear that whoever the Democrats' nominee is, whether Biden or someone else, the fall election is likely to be close, but it's likely to be close in a scenario where Trump does have the advantage.
Matthew, thank you. Anything else you want to
Right.
add that I didn't ask you?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. I do think it's interesting that a Texas congressman was the first.
Let's talk about that. Yeah. What do
Yeah.
you think about Lloyd Doggett's decision to come out and be the first voice from Congress?
It's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, it has hometown residents here in Texas. That's someone from our own state who became the first congressional voice to call for Biden to step aside. We should say actually that Dean Phillips has been calling for this for a long time. He actually ran against Joe Biden in the primaries. But other than that, Lloyd Doggett is the first to come forward. It's also notable because he is pretty near the ideological middle the Democratic caucus. He's not part of the squad. So this is not someone on the far left asking Biden to step aside, nor is it one of the most moderate or conservative members of the Democratic caucus, like a Henry Cuellar asking him to step aside. This is somebody who's fairly near the mainstream of the Democratic caucus asking him to step aside. I think the critical thing is whether his voice gets joined by others in the next day or two or three. If not, then he's kind of out on a limb by himself on this. But if he opened the floodgates and we start to see a cascade of others stepping forward, then I think this situation gets very, very dicey for President Biden.
I know that Julian Castro has said, he doesn't mind the idea of him stepping aside either. So I do wonder if we're going to see more, or like you said, if Lloyd Doggett is going to be kind of on this island. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, it will be, absolutely.